Greetings, Poe fans. Welcome to another edition of Poe Unplugged. I am Carmen Bolden.
And I am Jeanie Smith, and we are
The Poetastic Two.
Come zoom with us into the Unbook Club dedicated to the works of Mr. Edgar Allan Poe.
Good evening, Poe fans. Welcome back to Poe Unplugged. And tonight we are going to talk about the mystery surrounding Poe's death, which there are many theories out there. And we have two very special guests with us tonight. Chris Semtner from the Poe Museum, he's the curator there, and Mark Dawidziak, who is a celebrated author. And he has written a very apropos book for this evening. Not for this evening specifically, but about Poe's death.
We're not hosting a murder plot here, Carmen. Come on.
I know.
We're talking about the death of Poe. He's already dead. We're not going to kill him again.
No. We would at least know how he died.
Well, that's the whole point, right? I know what we're talking about. And Mark helped us out with the book that talks about his death. There's many different deaths, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct, Mark? Am I interpreting how you wanted to put it out there for everybody?
Yeah, I Poe is somebody who just keeps getting buried. You know, he gets buried literally once. You know, on October 8th, 1849. You know, the next day he's buried again because Griswold publishes the obituary, and then they, Griswold ain't done. He's going to continue to shovel dirt on top of the grave, and then 1875 they dig him up and bury him again, and so this guy just keeps getting buried, right? And and the cliche is, it's not original to me, but nothing stays buried in a Poe short story. So we keep going back. I'm trying to remember who said it, which I don't, because so many people like Chris helped me with the book and said so many insightful things, which is why they're quoted in the book. But one of them said that the discussion with Poe always starts with his death.
Yeah.
That with anybody, when you discuss somebody's life, you start in the logical place. You start when somebody is born. And yet with Poe, we always seem to reverse it. We start, and rightly so, the mystery of his death is so enticing. And I mean, I think I said the last time, we were on that this is the greatest literary stage exit of all time.
Yes.
And basically because it really does reflect and embrace his greatest accomplishments as a writer. They're all reflected right there in that death. It's a mystery. It's a horror story. And it defies analytical approach to try to solve it. So it would take a Poe himself to solve the mystery.
Oh, you say it's a mystery of mysteries?
I would say that. I think I did say that.
Exactly. Well, and also if you take a look at, like you were saying, that most people, when they start talking about Poe, it's all about his death. They start with the death. And it is one of the biggest mysteries. It ranks right up there to one of the most talked about, which is Jack the Ripper. It's a mystery. Nobody really knows about Jack the Ripper. There's all different kinds of theories out there. Just like with Poe, there's all different kinds of theories on how he died. Now, the one that I've heard and had heard since I was in school was my teachers would tell the one, because I was taking government classes and stuff, they would talk about the abuse of the voting, how they were taking Poe, taking advantage of Poe by liquoring him up, as the old saying goes in my neck of the woods, and taking him to the polls and having him vote for who they wanted, and then taking him back to the bar and making him do it again. So that's one of the theories that I heard way back when and through the years, but it's one of those theories. It's a hypothetical, so who knows? And I do believe you hit upon it. I can't remember exactly because it's been a while since I read the book. Sorry, Mark, but I think you touch upon it, don't you?
Well, you're referring to cooping.
Yes, that's I
Which
couldn't
was the
think of the word
practice
at the moment.
of kidnapping people and making them repeat voters. And there was an election going on when Poe got to Baltimore. And the problem with that is there's no evidence for it. I mean, it's a really good explanation for the missing days. It's a really Baltimore explanation because Baltimore was mob town.
Yeah.
You know, if Poe became incapacitated in Baltimore, that would have been a really bad place to be incapacitated. Any sea town, any town with a harbor would have had a rough area, would have had a rough reputation, or up and down the eastern seaboard. Baltimore had an even worse reputation. They took their rioting very seriously. They every few years that town would riot, which is how they got to be known as mob town. And cooping is a wonderful theory as to explain the missing days, but it doesn't technically explain what killed him.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe he got cooped. Does that accelerate something that was he sick when he left Richmond? Does this accelerate a pre-existing condition? Even if we were to be able to prove that he was cooped, and we can't, because nobody has ever come forward to say, yes, I saw Poe, I saw him being used as a repeat voter. It would help explain that why he was found in somebody else's clothes. That's that's again, cooping fits. But as somebody in Baltimore said to me, it almost fits too nicely, doesn't it? It's almost too perfect.
Yeah.
And it's such a Baltimore explanation as to what happened. And, it's like everything else with Poe. You're always in the land of conjecture and guesswork and theorizing because there is no hard evidence. There's no, again, I would have liked one person to have come forward to say, yes, I passed Poe on the streets of Baltimore on this day. I mean,
yeah, that's my issue. That's my issue with the cooping thing, right? He's a recognizable figure at this point in his life. His hometown is technically Baltimore. People would recognize him if he was in that state. Someone would have said something, just like when they found him unconscious, they knew who he was and they got someone to help him. So I have a hard time believing that he kept going through this voting cycle and no one was like, wait, isn't that Edgar Allan Poe? And not only that, I mean, he had such a distinct look. I mean, he had very unique features. I just have a hard time believing that is what actually happened. Even if it did, I just personally, you'd be like, hey, wait, stop,
Yeah.
Now, back then, the pictures we know of him now wouldn't have really been distributed. They would have known him through a couple of really bad engravings. There was a wood engraving from about 1843, and then there was a steel engraving from 1845, so 4 years earlier, where he just kind of looks bad. I think somebody compared his head to a cabbage, and he said it's something resembling a portrait of me, or something, a so-called portrait of me. And even in Philadelphia, they might not have recognized him. I think when he was supposedly arrested for public drunkenness in Philadelphia the summer before he died, apparently it was a judge who recognized him, but nobody else seems to recognize him. And then in Baltimore, I guess he could have slipped between the cracks for a while. Maybe they could not recognize him. Snodgrass, the guy who actually went to the polling place to pick him up after they found him, said he wouldn't have recognized Poe if he didn't know that was him, because he was in such rough shape. I guess he looked like he was slovenly. He wasn't dressed in the clothes he's used to wearing, and he just was sort of out of it. So he could have been doing anything in those few days. Could have been beaten, could have had his clothes stolen. And the cooping theory seems to come up right around 1860. There's a guy, John Reuben Thompson, who wrote a lecture about Poe's life and genius and death, and he started lecturing about the cooping theory. So I don't know what his source is. But then a couple of years earlier, Elizabeth Oates Smith wrote an article, I think it was in the United States Magazine, where she said, well, Poe actually skipped over Philadelphia entirely, went to New York, got beaten up there, then came back to Baltimore and died. And there's even less evidence of him skipping over Philadelphia to get all the way to New York. And this is 8 years after his death, she published that. And we don't know where she's getting her ideas.
Well,
it's one of the things that's going to. It's kind of fun actually, because one of the things that you realize when I sort of started the book, I kind of had the mentality of a detective on a case, and that's the way I sort of approached it. And detectives need expert witnesses. They need experts to tell them, this is what you should be looking for. This is what you shouldn't be looking for. But right from the start, one of the first things you realize when you examine the original witnesses is there's hardly a one of them that's reliable. And that's the number one thing you need. You need, especially when he's dying, when the one thing we finally know where Poe is. I mean, you think about this. When he leaves Richmond, and the second his foot hits the plank to get on that boat, he disappears from view. It is like a curtain comes down, and for several days we have nobody. We have nobody come forward. Like, wouldn't you think somebody would come forward at some point in the next few years and say, yes, I saw him at the railing of the steamer, or I passed him on the streets of Baltimore, something. But those days are completely shielded from our view. So finally we know where he is. He's discovered and he's taken to the hospital in Baltimore. And we finally know where he is. And we finally, okay, now we're going to get a reliable witness. No, now we get John Moran, who is the one person at this point who we need to be reliable and trustworthy. And he's none of those things. And he finally leaves behind 3 accounts of Poe's death. And I encourage everybody to read these 3 accounts side by side by side. They have no bearing on you would not even believe. He changes the time of death.
Oh, wow.
He changes Poe's last words. He is the most, and then later on he has an agenda too, because he wants to be a writer, and he invents all of this conversation that supposedly goes on with Poe. It is the most embarrassing conversation. It's Victorian melodrama at its worst. And Poe would have been embarrassed to have these words attributed to him. Everybody says, you can look up and say, what are Poe's last words? And I think a lot of people have gone with Moran saying that his last words were, God pity my poor soul, or whatever it was. I doubt it. I don't trust that any more than I trust anything else Moran had to say. So, and as I say, imagine what an attorney would do to John Moran on the stand. There would be nothing left of John Moran but shredded underwear when they got through with him. And so this is one of the and it's not just John Moran. It's Snodgrass. Everybody who enters into the picture later on compromise themselves in some way as witnesses. And so this is one of the reasons why I think, this will never be solved. Go back. There's a lot of reasons that you can, but one of the biggest, and any police detective would tell you this, one of the reasons is that the sheer unreliability of the witnesses is just a huge thing to get by. We need somebody we trust. We need one person who's reliable that we can trust. There is nobody. There's nobody there. There's either no witness at all in the case of the missing days, and then we have all the witnesses later on who are just a bundle of contradictions.
Yeah, which you did suddenly get this new article that popped up that had been hidden all these years, or maybe a new letter. You wouldn't believe it, because they published hoaxes back then, hoax books. Poe he perpetrated hoaxes himself. So, and there's the Ripper hoaxes out there. So if somebody said, oh yeah, absolutely, I was with Poe, I remember everything, you'd say, oh, well, they're probably lying too. Unless there's somebody absolutely unimpeachable. But then, even then, we can't really trust Nelson Poe or Henry Herring or any of the relatives.
Yeah.
And this John Moran, his accounts keep changing over time. And the earliest one is from a month after Poe's death. And David Galen, he's got a book about Poe's death coming out this year. And I think he proposed that it looks like he's just getting his information from notes probably that somebody else took on Poe's final days. So maybe John Moran wasn't really there. He's just taking notes on somebody else's information. But you have to read David Galen's book when it comes out.
Yeah. If you read Moran's account, he makes it sound like he's in attendance on Poe almost every minute. Now this was a very busy hospital with very little staff. He was probably not present at Poe's side all that often. And at some point they say, he's the attending physician who's probably not in attendance for a good part of the time. So again, that's one of the things which just absolutely floor you about Moran is right from the start. I think he's aggrandizing, and right from this, because the first account is to Muddy, is in response to, she wants to know about, so he composes this letter. And if you read this letter, some people say, well, it's the first one, it's the most trustworthy. I don't think so. I don't think it is. And one of the things is that enters into the mythology is that Poe shouted the name Reynolds. And we have had, armies of people trying to find out who Reynolds was, but later on that's missing from his other accounts. And then there is a Reynolds, but it's a family that comes. It's, this guy probably set people looking for treasure where treasure was not wherever could be found. When he put this, there is a, I can't remember who wrote the essay, but there's a really terrific piece. It's on the Poe Baltimore site, but somebody did research and did a fine thing where they basically cast complete doubt on whether Poe was shouted the name Reynolds.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to bring up, it was interesting that, they say that Poe's last word was Reynolds, and then, you got Citizen Kane, Cousin Rosebud, and then you got Red Rum written for Stephen King. I'm like, what is it with ours? I mean, is there like some kind of, it's like we're just creating our words that people say when they're died. Like, why can't people just say die? Sorry.
Like about the Reynolds thing. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Jeannie. I know, Chris, you made a video about this one. John Cusack is the world's worst Edgar Allan Poe in a movie, but I don't know if you guys seen that movie that's in. I think it's called The Raven. But I don't want to give any spoilers in there, but they play on the Reynolds thing in there. And to me, that kind of, I was like, okay, I hated the movie like the whole time, and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. I don't want to say anything.
I thought the movie was kind of crap, but I didn't think that John Cusack was so bad.
Oh, he's horrible. That's a whole other episode about how I hate him as Edgar Allan Poe. Hate him. Horrible. I barely can finish it.
But you should see if he'll do one of these sessions. See if you can get John Cusack on the line.
Yeah, we should.
We'll tell him to his face. It's funny enough, is my mom loves him and swears like he's this great actor. So I grew up thinking like he's this great actor. I was really excited when my husband was like, "Oh, have you seen this?" I'm like, "Oh my gosh, no." All I'm gonna say, is he played himself in that movie, not Edgar Allan Poe. He had a Van Gogh, not a mustache like Poe. Number one. So what was that about? And that's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah.
Started me off on the wrong foot, but I digress. We're not yet.
Well, let's keep in mind that even if John Cusack had been good, he would have been terrible because the script is awful.
Yes.
One of the reasons the script is because the script basically, I know we're talking about Poe's death here, and I know that's the reason, and I don't want to get too far off that, but I really didn't set out to write a book about Poe's death. I know that sounds, I fully copped to the fact that the whole idea of examining Poe's death was basically a device. And the device was to really talk about how Poe lived, not how he died. Because right from the start, I was much more interested in how Poe lived. And this just as much mystery there as there is about his death. And the main reason being because I never bought the image of Poe. Something didn't add up. Because when St. Martin's basically came to me and said, they wanted a book about Poe's death, and I realized they did want one of those Jack the Ripper books. They did want one of those books that purported to solve the case, and I told them it couldn't be done. I basically enumerated the reasons why this was impossible. But I told them, that the book I would write would be I would examine Poe's life using the death as the filter of examining this. So I really didn't set out to write a book about Poe's death, even as fascinated as I am with it, as much as anybody else is. I'm much more interested in the mystery of his life, because the image of Poe, it's impossible for that image to be the guy who wrote those stories and those poems. It doesn't add up. And, one of the things I wanted to do was kind of get behind the grotesque stereotype we have made of Poe and get at the real artist who created all of those stories and poems that we love so much. Now, the problem I had with the Cusack movie, and I don't think that he's entirely to blame for this, is that it plays completely to the stereotype.
Yes.
That's all it is. It's a stereotype on parade. And it's basically saying, you want the Poe that you think that this is what we're going to give you. It doesn't ring true. Why does it not ring true? Because it isn't true. Because there's not an element of truth to it. So that's one of the reasons I think,
the belligerent drunk in the movie, like he's belligerent, he's drunk, he's just right off the bat, and he's just breathing through his mouth and everything, and I'm like, oh, stop. But yeah, sorry.
No, I think the main problem with that was just that he wasn't trying to solve the mystery. Like, we know that Poe was trying to solve the murder of Mary Rogers, and he was very systematic about this, and the movie just sort of had him show up just before the murder runs off the other direction. So it's just a bunch of near misses, sort of artificially creating that sense of action, when it's really just he stumbled upon something. Oh, there goes the killer. Oh, there he goes again. Missed him again.
Yeah.
But I think that there's multiple Poes, that it's not just the historical figure of the guy that we could have actual historical evidence about, but there's the man, the myth, the monster. There's the Poe that Griswold created. There's the Poe that was on South Park, who's the godfather of goth. And there's even the Cusack Poe, but there's also the altered carbon Poe, who's just the hologram Poe who runs the hotel. And so he's been fractured into a whole bunch of different little Poes. And there, somewhere in there was that historical figure, but it also, I think those other ones had their validity too. That, I guess, as Mallarmé wrote the poem, the Tomb of Edgar Poe, and he said it in a more poetic way, but he said basically Poe became what he is by dying. He became that figure that he is today by dying. And now everybody's just sort of seeing it through different lenses. So the biographer's job is to try to find out where in the middle of that, somewhere, there's this person who lived from 1809 to 1849, and what you can verify behind the myth, behind the monster. But also Poe threw us some curveballs too. He told everybody he went to fight the Greek Wars of Independence, but ended up getting captured in St. Petersburg, Russia. So he tried to mythologize himself. So is there truth to that? And I guess Werner Herzog said that, sometimes that the truth is more than just the facts. Like, if you just wanted the truth, you could read the phone book, and that'd have a list of names and addresses, and they're accurate, but they don't really tell you who the person is. And what is the truth of that person? How do you find that truth? So that's your job.
Yeah. And every biographer is going to. Somebody asked me just the other day, I got a Facebook message, and somebody said, I'm really enjoying your book. What other biographies would you recommend? And, I went right back to Quinn. I went right back to Arthur Hobson Quinn and said, it's in many ways the indispensable biography. because it's now 80 something years old. But Quinn's the first one that kind of formalizes Poe research, really brings standards to it, and really starts to try to untangle the complex mountain of misinformation that had been built up around Poe, starting with Griswold and working its way through. And Quinn's not the easiest read anymore. Quinn wrote in a very academic 1930s style, and it's not an easy, popular read, but it is still an amazing book for all of that. In many ways, everybody who has contributed, and that's a big army of people who have contributed to Poe research and scholarship, have been carrying on the work of Quinn. I really think he's the godfather of all of this. And, thank goodness, because, that book, and then, you get these really huge contributions like the prologue. When the prologue was published, it's hard to remember what a big event that was. And what an impressive event it was. It's still impressive, all these years later. That's still an impressive piece of work. And everybody's got a little piece of the picture. I'm a great fan of other biographies of Poe. Some are terrific because they're really well written, like the Julian Simmons biography. Some are incredibly insightful. Some are monumental pieces of work, like the Silverman. Everybody brings something into this, which but everybody comes at it differently. And I cop right to how I came at it. My book is a working writer's view of a working writer, plain and simple. That's the way I approached it. I do not pretend to be an academic. I'm not. And you cannot pretend to be a type of writer you're not. So, my view of this was, as a working writer, I wanted to answer my questions of how does, the working writer, what is that process like? What is that, and I think we talked about it the last time. The one thing we always denied Poe in all of these kinds of fractured that Chris is talking about, the thing we always seem to deny him is a sense of humor, which is criminal. Poe had a great sense of humor, and it runs through the criticism. He's very funny in the criticism. He's very funny in the horror stories. He can be really, sneaky funny in the horror stories. So the fact that we deny Poe a sense of humor when almost every single person who is a descendant of Poe and does horror has a great sense of humor. Robert Bloch had a great sense of humor. Ray Bradbury had a great sense of humor. Stephen King has a great sense of humor. Anne Rice has a great sense of humor. All the directors, all the writers, all the actors. And as Stephen King said, you have to have a great sense of humor to do this, or else you go nuts. And you also have to have this basic understanding that humor and horror are flip sides of the same coin. If you do not understand that, you can't write either. You will fail at writing both. So how in the world can we deny, if Poe is really this good at this, if we really acknowledge that he's this good, let's get rid of the stereotype then and get to the guy. Is one of the reasons this guy was so good was because he did have a good sense of humor? Yeah. I mean, that's clear. That's clear from any fair reading of who Poe was, that he had a great sense of humor. So I think that's by luck, but everybody comes at it differently, thank goodness.
A lot of people just completely skip the work altogether. They remember it from middle school and they assume, oh yeah, I read in middle school as kind of something I was forced to read, and they forget about it, and they just sort of vaguely remember, oh, that's the one about the heart under the floorboards, right? But if you actually read The Telltale Heart, there's a lot of good one-liners, like, I was never kinder to the old man than I was for the whole week before I killed him.
Yes.
Or The Cask of Amontillado, that's got some good zingers, like, oh, true.
I shall not die of a cough.
Yeah.
True. It's a laugh line. It's a laugh line. He's letting you in on the joke. It's not just a laugh line. He's basically saying, I'm letting you in on this. And that's crafty. That is just really crafty stuff. So Yeah, he is, and we have evidence that he was personally funny, that he could be very witty, that he could be very charming, that he could be, just a very funny person when he wanted to be. And I'm not trying to whitewash. I be the first thing. Poe would have been a difficult friend. I think Poe would have been the very definition of high maintenance as a friend. As I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Steve in Philadelphia, who was it was a National Park Service, and it's in the book. He said that if there was if it was a Sunday afternoon, you were having Sunday dinner, and there was a knock on the door, and you had a peephole, and you could look through the peephole, and you saw it was Edgar Allan Poe, you'd probably pretend you weren't home. That's a great way to say it. That's a great way to sort of say, yeah, we say today high maintenance. Could Poe be sensitive? Could he be, yeah, oh yeah. But most of the great writers, that you could have said the same thing about Dickens. Was Dickens hypersensitive? Oh yeah. Was Twain hypersensitive? Yep. But I think that goes with the territory.
Absolutely. Well, I think Keith, you were the one that suggested this topic, correct? He's muted. Keith, are you there?
I think he's there, but he doesn't know he's muted himself.
Yeah, let me see. Hold on. Let me unmute him.
No. All right, who put chat? Somebody put some in chat.
Let's see. Will said, is Poe more likely to look into himself and isolate himself during hard times, or more to unload on whoever will listen? That's a great question.
And think of him after his wife died. He just sort of shut himself off from the world for a while, and people thought, oh, he's about to die. He's got brain fever. But then in some of the letters, like when he's 26 years old, and this is before he moved Virginia and Muddy down here to Richmond, he wrote this letter just pouring out his heart to a casual acquaintance. Just, I'm so depressed. I don't know why I'm so depressed. And he's just looking for somebody who can console him. So sometimes he seems to really pour his heart out to people. And there's that letter of 1848 or 1849. It's a long letter he wrote that I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. And he's just pouring out his heart and soul to a sympathetic ear. But then there's other times that he just sort of shut himself off. And he's able to be both at once.
Yeah.
Which he had a sense of pride, so he didn't want people feeling sorry for him. He didn't want at least the general public, when he found out that people had collected donations for him and his wife during her illness, he was a little bit embarrassed by that. So he wanted to pour out, but he doesn't want the public to kind of see the intimate details of dressing up a little bit wealthier clothes than he can afford, putting on airs in the heir to John Allen's fortune, but not for Allen's second wife. So he wants to portray himself as a Southern gentleman, even though he really wasn't of that class. He was the son of an actress, and his foster father was a merchant. So the merchants are a little bit below the planter class. And definitely actresses are way below that.
Do you think that those missing days, kind of like with what Chris, you just said about the letter of him, and shutting himself off, could he have decided to shut himself off for a few days? And then, could that be a possibility that he just kind of stayed somewhere alone, contemplating what he was doing next? I know, like, you're one of the most recent Curator's Crypt, you bring up the last letter that he wrote and raised some good questions, I thought, of, he wasn't supposed to be in Baltimore. And so I thought maybe we could touch on that.
Well, if he were incapacitated, if he had something to drink, he could be sick for days. We know that when he got to Richmond earlier that year in July, he was bedridden for days and doctors were attending him. So he didn't have a cell phone on him at the time. So if he showed up, inebriated or sick, and he was sick before he left Richmond, according to Elmira. She said he had a fever and a weak pulse and kind of dizzy. So if something was causing him to be incapacitated, what would be a cure for it? Stimulants, right? And they thought alcohol was a stimulant. So if he took a little bit of that, that might have made him worse. So he might have just been bedridden somewhere, or he was cooped, or he was mugged, or something that just didn't allow him to reach out to the world. And it looks like when he did reach out, it was when this Joseph Walker just happened to come upon him and asked, do you know anybody can help you? And it's interesting. He didn't say, oh yeah, my Uncle Henry Herring lives here, or my cousin Nelson lives here, or some other relative. He said, that Joseph Snodgrass, that magazine editor Snodgrass, he can help me. So
yeah, I like with that, like, because Mark talks about that in his book, where he kind of like just kind of talks to him about some crazy like things that he wasn't like having a brain fever, like images that he was like seeing. That's why I like the brain tumor for several different reasons. And I know we can't prove when they picked up this school and they said they thought they heard something in there, because tumors do calcify upon death. So I like that. Of course, we can't tell if it was a pebble or anything else. But this is kind of like a weird kind of connection that a lot of really brilliant writers and other people actually die of brain tumors. Like Mary Shelley, for instance, in his own, amongst his own like time period, she died of a brain tumor. Like Thomas Wolfe died of a brain tumor. And if you just do like if you just do like a quick Google search, like a lot of like really brilliant, extremely brilliant people actually died of a brain tumor. And don't quote me on this, because this is a long time ago. I remember in physics class, they were talking about Albert Einstein when he died. He didn't have a brain tumor, but he did have like some weird little piece of like metal stuck in his brain from like an accident that may have made him smarter. So, I mean, it's just kind of, I just kind of think it's kind of like a weird kind of artsy approach to the whole thing, but I kind of like brain humor for me.
Yeah, it's a possibility, especially considering the weird behavior exhibited in Philadelphia earlier that summer. There was something going on with him. Of course, the account we have of his weird behavior comes, this was the 1890s that John Sartain actually wrote it down. So good, at least almost 50 years later, he's writing down what Poe was saying and doing in Philadelphia. So it's inevitable that there's some changes made. And then that John Thompson I mentioned, less than a decade after Poe's death, he wrote down some strange vision that Poe had while he was in Philadelphia. So something went on there. And whether it's a brain tumor or something else, it's another one of those mysteries. That's the good thing about this, is that it is a mystery of mysteries, because we can't prove anything. We can sort of narrow some things down with the testing of the hair. They were able to rule out some things. They said, well, it doesn't look like Poe had elevated lead levels that would result in his death, or elevated mercury levels that would have killed him. His wife had way higher lead, mercury in her system than Poe did. And they were also trying to test maybe it was carbon monoxide buildup in his system over time by testing his hair, and that didn't really turn up. So we're able to rule out a few things, like maybe the rabies theory, but when it comes down to it, it's just a mystery. And maybe that mystery is what makes Poe who he is, that if he really begins life with his death, and his death is a mystery, that's apropos.
Yes.
And if I said this last time, forgive me, I'll probably say it again next time. But we would lose much more than we would gain by solving Poe's death.
Yeah.
There is a romantic element to this being, that the father of the modern detective story, that the father of the modern horror story leaves us with this unsolvable case. I think that if you were to say flat out, do you want it solved? I'd probably say no.
Yeah, we'd have to change the whole exhibit over there, and that would be a real
That's
headache.
true.
But the thing about this is, because this is about Poe's death, Poe died under, because some of the people that I interviewed for the book were forensic pathologists and forensic anthropologists, and they use very, very specific terms. These are very serious people. And, one of the things they took great pains to explain to me is that Poe died under what they would call, non-specific symptoms. If we take what we know of Poe's dying, if we take the general body of knowledge on fate, and I don't think you can even do that, but if we do, Poe seems to have died of what was described then as brain fever. Now, that could be what causes brain fever? What is that? Is that encephalitis? Yeah, what is that? All of the symptoms that Poe had, that we take the body of the symptoms that we're going to say, okay, we think that this is trustworthy. They fit a staggering number of causes. The fact that he was out of his head, that he was hallucinating, that his nervous system was shot, all of these things, a staggering number of things can cause these. So you can come up with a theory like rabies and bend your theory around the non-specific conditions. And that's what people have done, throughout the years. Everybody comes up with it, and they'll continue to do it because you can make this work because of the lack of good evidence and the fact that the symptoms that we have are not specific to a particular disease or a particular cause. You can build a very good case of drink killing Poe. You can make a very good case for this. He is enrichment, and he is drinking. And doctors tell him basically, if you keep this up, your system just is not going to be able to sustain it much longer. You're going to die. And Poe, while he's in Richmond, takes the pledge. He joins the Sons of Temperance. And, by all accounts, he kept it. That he did stay off of it. Does he drink at some point in the missing days once he leaves Richmond? Again, we don't know, but we do know that drink had a tremendously devastating effect on his system.
Yeah.
We know that it takes him days. So the missing days, if he drinks and he's incapacitated, drink could have done it. There's no question. So you can build this wonderful circumstantial case for alcohol being the cause of death.
And you can also layer some things on top of each other. It could be some kind of meningitis, tubercular meningitis. Then he got drunk. Then he got cooped. Then he got beaten. Then he's in the hospital. Maybe they weren't attending him. Maybe they just sort of left him. They figured, he's just one of the drunks, and just sort of left him. And maybe Moran scrambled after the fact and said, "Oh yeah, I totally attended him the whole time. I didn't ignore him for the first couple of days." And then for that first letter that Moran wrote, he mentions he gave him beef tea and stimulants.
Yeah.
So he was getting whiskey and beef tea. And then later, of course, in one of his later accounts, he says, I offered Poe whiskey, and he said, I shall never touch that demon rum.
Yes. Playing to the rafters.
Yeah. So anything, the doctor could have made it worse.
Yeah. Oh.
And, the thing that for people, if you want to start a dust up among Poe scholars, just say the word alcohol. Because it's almost become a verboten topic among Poe scholars because it's such a minefield.
Yeah.
And there's some people who just are sure that drink was this, but it doesn't really matter. Drink was a problem for Poe. And it also doesn't matter how much he drank and how often. When he did drink, it had a devastating effect on his system.
Yeah.
Accumulating over the years. Each time, he is probably undermining his health in the long run. So alcohol, to me, although I don't think it's the primary cause of his death, I think, as detectives, we have it in the room as an accomplice.
Yeah.
Alcohol is always there. And if it's not the main cause of his death, it's certainly a contributing factor. Whether he drinks in the last few days or not, because he has a lifetime of these incidents where he drinks and he takes to his bed for days. It's like, for the rest of us, it's a morning hangover and a cup of coffee and a bad day. For Poe, no. It wasn't just a bad morning. It was a bad several days.
Yeah.
So alcohol's you can't get rid of it. You cannot get rid of it as part of the story. And like I said, if we were detectives, we would have alcohol back in the room constantly. And maybe we treat this as one of the main accomplices of this thing.
Mark, I really like the theory that you put forth in your book about how and why he died. I won't say what it is for people who have not finished reading the book.
Oh, I think it's out there. I think we don't have to.
But I agree with that. I think it's a great deduction, and I tend to agree with that.
Well, remember, and it's also not mine. I was not the one who came up with that theory. I settled on it as the one that I believe is the answer. But there were many very fine Poe scholars who would have said tuberculosis as a cause.
It is so plausible. It really is.
Well, it's the person of interest, isn't it? Who has who has the most means and opportunity here? Who throughout Poe's lifetime, what's the present right from the start? What does his mother die of?
Yeah.
If most accounts put him at the deathbed, and so Poe could have been affected right from the start. He could have been carrying, and as every medical historian said to me that I talked to for the book, the odds of Poe having tuberculosis, having been infected. Now remember, it's a difference between being infected with tuberculosis and it actually being active.
Right.
But the notion, what are the odds that Poe had tuberculosis? 100%. It's not 90, it's not 95, it's 100%. He had to have been infected with. So he's carrying the means of it, and probably throughout his life, he's in close proximity to it. And by the way, a staggering number of the population was infected. This was an airborne disease, and it was a very common, it was one of the major killers. I think it was the single biggest killer of children. The fact that Poe didn't have tuberculosis is just off the table. It's out of the question.
Yeah. And even today, at least in Tennessee, teachers, the one medical test that they have to have before they can enter a classroom, once they're background checked and all that, is a TB test. And we have to provide that. And it just kind of shows what it could do to so many people if you were a carrier. Absolutely.
But again, one of the reasons I was pushed to was the experts, because it wasn't my deduction. It was the fact that so many people said to me, "Boy, I sure like this as a cause. I really think this is it." And when you have one of the leading forensic pathologists in the country say that to you and say, "Look, I can't prove it, but if you were to say, what do you think he died of? This is it." That's awfully convincing.
And I think, Keith, you were the one that suggested this topic tonight, correct?
I did. I
think you did.
Okay, well, if I did, I forgot I did.
That's okay. That's okay. And so I wanted. Yes, and so I wanted to see what your theory was, since you suggested it.
My theory goes along with Holly about the brain tumor. I mean, that's the conclusion that I personally came to, because I've read everything from carbon monoxide poisoning to rabies to metal poisoning to cooping to the woman he was engaged to marry, her brother's killing him, to a bunch of stuff. I do agree that that doctor changed his story every chance he was interviewed, because every article I pulled or looked at, and I went through magazines like the Smithsonian and other places. I just didn't stick to Wikipedia. I went all over the place just to try to find things out. And of course, what Reynolds was one thing he said on his deathbed, and then there was another big long speech that he supposedly said about, oh, where is it? I wrote it down, but I'm having a hard time reading my writing because I was in a hurry. It was wait a minute, I had it right here. Oh, okay. I have a notebook full of this stuff. Oh, Poe supposedly said quite poetically, "The arched heavens encompass me, and God has his degree legibly written upon the frontlets of every created human being and demon incarnate. Their goal will be something of blank despair." Now, I'd probably have missed a couple of words there because I cannot read my own shorthand. But it popped out at me in something that I pulled up on in the internet. It was from something about the credibility of Dr. Moran, and it caught my eye. It was in a Wikipedia just toward the end of it. I'm like, oh, this is new, because I knew about the Reynolds thing, but I'm like, well, I don't recall ever being told this or ever hearing about this. But the more I read, and I'm reading, I've got two books going. I've got Holly's book, which I'm enjoying greatly, Holly, and I've got his book. One's in the living room and one's in the bedroom. So I've got two books going. but I really kind of fall toward the brain tumor thing, because they do, I forgot the word I was going to say.
Well, in actuality, if you look at it, we went to a presentation by Dr. Hal Poe, who's a professor at Union University and also a descendant of Edgar Allan Poe. And he presented the three things, and he actually said that all three could have actually happened. Like, he could have had a brain tumor, which would explain some of his mental breakdowns or whatever you want to call them. Tuberculosis could also be why he was gaunt or losing weight, and those kinds of things. And alcohol, he could have just been allergic to the alcohol, the wheat or the barley or whatever they had in there. That he could have been, was it gluten intolerant? I don't know. But the thing about it is, and this is the one thing I love about it, it caters to the major conspiracy that is ingrained in all humanity, in my opinion. It is the ultimate conspiracy theory. It's like, it was the ultimate conspiracy theory even before JFK. And it's actually, in my opinion, outgrown JFK. Because at least with JFK, everybody is like settled on something that they're like, yeah, somebody did it. We know who did it. We don't care. Move on. But it's like with Poe, it's like everybody wants to know, but they don't want to know. I mean, because if you break that seal and you prove, air quotes here, you prove something, then it loses its romanticism. It loses its ability to draw people in. And so, because we are conspiracy theorists at heart, everybody has something, whether it's Sasquatch, whether it's the Yeti, or the same thing, but different parts of the world. But, there's always something. And Edgar Allan Poe, hey, there's still, maybe could be, he's not really dead. Who knows?
That's what my husband thinks. He didn't want to come on here, but he was like, it's like the Elvis thing. He faked his death. He's like, I'm convinced that he's actually walking around. I'm like, okay.
He's a time traveler,
Yeah, something. He's still, yeah.
And for me,
it would be nice.
The darkness, the conspiracy, everything that surrounds his death just adds to his writings, in my opinion. It draws you in to think, oh, what was going on when he wrote this? Was he, what was going on in his brain? What was happening in his life? why this, why that. So I think it just connects so much better with the conspiracy theory along with his writings to make it more mysterious and make it more Poe-esque.
Yeah, he was building. Oh, sorry, Jeanie. I was just saying, like you're saying, like he was building his brand before there was like building your brand. Like, right? It's like right on path with him how he died. Like, he actually, like, I'm sure he'd be pretty mad that he died, but he'd probably be pretty happy about the little conspiracy after the fact, and that he's still being talked about because of it. He'd be like, yes, did it.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Has anyone actually done seance to try to, connect with Poe? I know somebody has to have somewhere down the line.
Helen Whitman did, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
And I think Jeffrey Abigail did when he owned the Hiram Haynes house down in Petersburg. He used to have seances upstairs, the honeymoon suite.
Yeah.
I
just think that would be cute. To have a video effect of something like, or have a movie with that, not John Cusack, but a movie based around doing a seance and you're talking to Poe. It's kind of like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure meets seance from Poe. Okay.
Well, I love Bill and Ted. I don't know how that would work.
Poe published several poems after he died. There's different mediums claim that he gave them poems. Like Lizzie Doden was one of them, published a few different poems that she said Poe gave her. So he kept writing. Death didn't slow him down at all.
No.
He's still regular, at least 3 different bars. He's at the General Wayne Inn. He's at the horse she came in on, and he's also at another one, I think in Delaware. He still shows up, and the horse he came in on, they say that they save a stool for him in case he feels like drinking that night, even though apparently he never actually visited that building. At least he's haunting it now. And even
he can drink out
go in. Apparently, Poe's mother's ghost is haunting there, even though there wasn't actually anything there when she was alive. So why not have Poe pop in too while you're at it?
That's right. I mean, but it is a point. Is that Poe, as much as we're talking about his death and all of this, the real laugh that Poe gets here on everybody is that he is the most alive writer in the world.
Yes.
The most amazing thing about Poe is this is again why, and I'll talk about this tomorrow night, but the reason I reversed the subtitle and made it The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe is because this guy's got the best afterlife of any writer ever. I mean, it's just that I am never ceased to be stunned when I do, and I can't lost count of how many talks I've done on Poe over the last year. Of all kinds to all kinds of people, and everybody's got a connection to Poe. Everybody. They you don't have to explain the Telltale Heart to them. You don't have to explain the Raven to them. Just try that with Melville. Just try that with Thoreau. Try that with, for that matter, go into a Barnes and Noble and show me the shelves of merchandise for Thoreau. Show me, show me the people walking around in T-shirts and have, Poe is such an alive presence with so much street cred.
Yes.
Author is, we say, what would Poe think? Well, I think the number one thing Poe would think is he would be delighted that he is still remembered. We recognize him, we recognize his face, we recognize his presence, and we actually recognize the titles and the stories, which is the ultimate tribute to a writer.
Yes.
That you can actually remember. I can't tell you, after a talk, there's at least one person, could be of any age, could be a teenager, could be a senior citizen, and they come up to me and they say, when I was in school, I had to memorize the first 4 stanzas of The Raven, and then they do it.
Yes.
And I let them. I've never stopped anybody from doing it because I think, who can do that? Who can do that with Walt Whitman? Who can do that with Emily Dickinson? We can do it with Poe. And, and they know the story. Okay, yes, it's a small group of stories and a small group of poems, but my Lord, it's not just here in this country, it's around the world. And as I would like to say, that the 2 most recognized American writers are Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain. But I really think we read Poe more than we read Twain now.
I think so too.
I think Poe is better, and I think that's true around the world. It's certainly true there in this country. I think Poe is now better read, much better.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry to say, but I think society has caused that with Mark Twain, because, and I'm kind of surprised they haven't tried it with Edgar Allan Poe yet, because of the the time period that things going on, and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, I'm like, why? This was that time period. You cannot view things in your own mind in today with what was going back then. And that's why Mark Twain, he is an awesome author. I mean, he had such wonderful stories, and it was such down home type in that area that he brought to life. And that's kind of like what Poe did with his area and his time. So I'm like, just read it and enjoy, experience it. You have to experience something before you can, what's the word I want to say here, before you cancel it. I'm just going to say it. Okay.
Well, I was going to say judge it. Because I tell my students all the time, regardless of whatever we're reading from whatever time period, keep with what we're reading. You've got to look at the context of when it was written, and don't assume things, because things then are not the same things now. And we have lots of conversations about that. And my students seem to really appreciate that, and they understand the work better and can look at it, things from a different lens. We talked a lot about this when we did To Kill a Mockingbird, and they loved it. They loved the work. And, just again, that context is so important to understand.
Yeah. And getting people to understand that and appreciate it is getting more difficult. And that's why I'm so happy that Poe is actually surviving and thriving, no matter what, whether he's still alive.
I think one reason is that because Poe is writing, what we give people to read for Poe is dealing with metaphoric, fear, horror, all of this, and that that doesn't tend to get trapped.
Right.
That doesn't tend to get trapped by that what you're talking about, that taking of a 21st century yardstick and measuring other times by that, using that yardstick. I think Poe has the advantage of also being introduced in the 7th grade for the most part.
Yeah.
Almost, I'm sure there are exceptions, but a large percentage of people get introduced to Poe in the 7th grade.
Yes.
And that's an age, it's a wonderful age to get it. It's a fantastic age to get Poe and to get that kind of writing, and because it's an era where most kids don't like to read. Most kids, reading is a chore. And all of a sudden, we give you Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is, walling people up in catacombs and sticking them in torture chambers and dismembering corpses. And all of a sudden, it's like, this is reading?
Yes.
This is fun. Ask any teacher, they'll tell you they love getting to the part where they teach Poe, and the students love getting it.
Yes.
I did. And this is my father did. My father, in the depths of the Depression, in the 1930s, got Edgar Allan Poe at that age. And he didn't mind when I got it in the 7th grade because he already loved it. He didn't object. Why he didn't object is the miracle. Because can you imagine? Just imagine for 1 second the hue and cry if you gave 7th graders these very same stories and they were written by contemporary authors. Imagine what people they would take these stories home and say, we're reading a story where, somebody plans a murder and dismembers the corpse of an old man and hides it under the floorboards. People would lose their minds if you told them that. And yet it's Edgar Allan Poe, and nobody raises an eyebrow about it. And the reason is because at this point, grandparents, parents, they all got it. And they all loved it. So they don't object.
Yes.
They don't, one little word of objection to it. And, my daughter got Poe in the 7th grade. Everybody just keeps getting reintroduced. I think I said this the last time too, but the public school system with the pop culture have been the 1-2 punch that kept Poe going.
Yeah.
To a degree that no other writer has kept going. Is the fact that you can do an Edgar Allan Poe story on SpongeBob SquarePants.
Yes.
And people will get it, will understand it, or that he can be a character on The Simpsons and South Park, and people will understand it. Who can you do that with? How can you possibly do that with anybody else? So I think that's why I say that he has the most amazing afterlife of anybody. Death doesn't mean anything. Death can't contain him. He's going to explode out of the grave.
And it seems to be Poe's character too. There's something when we come up with all these different Poes, we feel like we know him. And Kafka said it felt like he was a brother, and Baudelaire acted like, oh, this is his American brother. I was about to write something. It looks like Poe already wrote it. And then we were just out in the Poe shrine. I showed him all the kisses on Poe's bust, and those aren't even half of them because I wiped the kisses off on Mondays, and more people come kiss him, even though it's entirely unsanitary. And then we were looking at some of the little poems that people left. There's little Valentine, the heart, and people are still writing poems. They feel like they know him. They feel like he's that outsider. Whenever somebody feels like they don't quite fit in, like they don't quite belong, like nobody really understands them, they say, that's Poe. That's how he felt. And I guess we relate to this image that's been created of Poe. And some of his letters he did write about how, oh yeah, men have cast me aside and only a few sympathetic women have been guardian angels to me. So Poe did help bolster that a little bit, that idea of being the misunderstood artist or the poet maudit, the mad poet who lives on the fringes of society. But a lot of times he was right in the middle of society. He was going to Anne Lynch's parties every week and people reading his works. That's the third cat I've seen today. And so he could be a little bit of everything. He could be a lot of different people's brothers, or he could be their hero. We had an employee here who, when she was in middle school, she and her friends made little Edgar Poe trading cards, and they had little Poe cards they traded. And so he's part of the family. And I remember, I guess it was Vincent Price's daughter, she came to the museum, and her father made all these Poe movies, and she told us, oh yeah, I thought of Poe like an uncle. I didn't realize, he'd been dead since 1840s, but the way he feels so alive, he feels real in maybe a way that a lot of other authors from the 1840s don't feel like they're real. They feel like distant figures who they're high up on some pillar somewhere. And a lot of the statues you see of different authors are up on some pillar. You look up and see them, but then you go to Boston, that Poe statue is right there on the sidewalk with you. You just walk right up to him. He's standing where you're standing. And if you come to the Poe Museum, you can actually see the socks he was standing in. They're not on his feet anymore, though.
Yeah.
He didn't get the feet.
No.
Well, you mentioned the kisses on his bust. That reminds me of growing up in Memphis, visiting Elvis's house. This was even before he died. My mother loved Elvis, and so we would drive over to his house, and the big thing was signing your name on the wall outside of Graceland and hoping you'd get a glimpse of him. And to me, that's that same kind of pop culture status of, Elvis in music, Poe in literature, and it's just, because it's kind of the same thing. And some people, I think, would kiss the wall and things like that. It's just that holding him up to how great he was as a writer and what he means to each individual. And, when you read him at the beginning of, around 7th grade and then later in life.
Well, if you ever notice that you never see Poe and Presley in the same place at the same time,
true.
They both have the same initials.
Yes, they do, and both born in January.
And Presley had the twins.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
There's a lot of little.
We've solved the mystery. Poe faked his death and came back as Elvis.
Yes.
Very plausible. I never thought about that.
He's the king. Yes.
Oh.
Well, one of the things that you said that I want to touch upon earlier, Chris, I think it was you and not Mark, was about how Poe is still around and how the people in that time period, that the authors aren't really there. Well, the thing that hit me with that is like, when I think of that time period, I think about the characters and the stories. I don't think about authors. But Poe is the only one that is the author and the works that come together and is still alive, because, Frankenstein, I'm like, oh, Frankenstein is still, Mary Shelley and all those. That was the same time period in that area. But Mary Shelley, yeah, she was a female writer. So that was one of the things that she's remembered for. But at the same time, you think of one and you think of the other, but you can't really separate them like Poe. Poe has his own presence as just being Poe, not the guy who wrote The Raven or the guy who wrote Telltale Heart. He has his own separate identity, is what I'm kind of saying. Is he's got a dual identity, and it's both thriving, both as the author and as the person.
Well, he also became part of the story. This whole story about Poe's death and the mystery, Poe's a character in that story.
Yep.
So it's like real life is another story. Is like Byron. When you read Byron, oh yeah, that is the guy who went to Venice. He's the guy who did all these crazy things. That's Byron's part of the story. Poe's part of the Poe's story, but Poe's story just happens to be a mystery with a tragic death. And
Yep. And we all love a good mystery.
Absolutely. Will added, I have never heard Poe's voice, but whenever I read his stories, I always have the same inner voice narrating that it's almost like he's reading to me. Yeah, I agree with that. Same for me. And I think of a really cool Southern Virginia accent is actually what I picture in my head.
Several people, Chris was one, but several people had said to me that the point that to really get Poe, you have to read it out loud.
Yes.
You have to read it out loud, and some of it doesn't even time out right unless you account for the very specific Southern accent or Virginia accent. And that's true. I mean, Poe does come alive for each of us because of that voice.
Yeah.
We all hear different voices, but that's very true. Is that what is the voice of certain writers, and voice is key. But sometimes people read Poe now and they say, "Oh, it sounds old. It sounds very, very, archaic. The language sounds." And the truth is, Poe is very modern. And not only is he very modern, he's so modern, it took a long time for us to catch up to him. Poe was a loner in a lot of ways, but maybe the principal way that he was a loner was he was a genius. And he understood that he was that good. Can you imagine how that must have isolated him? Just in every day walking around, knowing how good you were, and knowing that all these people who were being, rewarded with all of the riches that you think you should have and have been denied to you. And he knew it.
Yeah, he wrote an essay about it.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he, this is the guy who is in some way isolated by his own genius. And what he wrote, because you have to understand that, in the 19th century, one of the reasons Poe was not appreciated, not only in his lifetime, but for several decades after, is everybody thought that at that time that literature should uplift. There should be something in literature which was morally uplifting. Now, Poe didn't always believe in morals to stories. There's several things he rejects them to a certain extent. So when Poe dies, you not only at the time have what were called the poets of the hearth, being the beloved poets like Longfellow, who were read because they were uplifting and they had morally superior themes in what they were doing. And this leads into the Chautauqua movement. And the Chautauqua movement is all about uplift. So Poe is not really recognized. It really takes the 20th century for us to catch up to Poe. Mm-hmm. When we hit the 20th century and you get the horrors of the First World War and the Spanish influenza and the Depression and the Second World War and the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, all of a sudden, Poe becomes a very modern writer during this period, and we catch up to him and realize Poe's telling us something about human nature. Poe is way ahead of these guys. And by that time, who's reading Longfellow? By that time, who's reading all those people? This is where I say Poe, has the last laugh, because he is going to outlast, outshine, and outlive all those people who are supposed to outlast him, who are supposed to be the better writers. Well, guess what happened? He flipped the switch.
Yep. Well, does anybody have any other theories or any other comments, thoughts?
Well, it'll come as no surprise that I do.
Go ahead.
I wanted to go back to something that Holly said. The whole brain tumor theory was popularized by Matthew Pearl when he wrote the book, The Poe Shadow, which is a fabulous book. It was a good book then. It's a good book now. It's really well done. And Matthew was one of the people I interviewed for the book. And Matthew said at the time that he said, yeah, I came up with the whole brain tumor thing. I think it's good. I think, if you ask me, I would say it. But he said, would I insist on it? No. And he said, at that point, I really don't have a dog in the fight. And I'm not going to say that that's what it is, insist on it. And that's exactly the way, I kind of view this, that if you look at this and you think it's a brain tumor, I'm not going to sit here and go, no. As even if you think it's rabies, and I think rabies is a very far-fetched idea now. I think it's one of the ones that almost can be taken off the table. But if you do think it is, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to say, because again, at the end of the day, I can't prove what I think it is either. So that's what makes this discussion endlessly fun, endlessly fascinating, and thank goodness. Thank goodness we don't have the means and opportunity to actually solve this.
Oh, one more thing about that. We were talking about why was he in someone else's clothing, and the cooping makes the most sense. But how he was really paranoid, and he thought that the brothers of his fiance were chasing him and everything. So he shaved his mustache before that. I mean, he could have just changed his clothes to be incognito, again, like a paranoia kind of thing. So it's just popped in my head. But,
the John Evangelist Walsh book, Midnight Dreary, which, which I think is a wonderful book until you get to his solution. It actually is a really well-written book. And I thought it's very well researched. I don't think he believed his own theory myself. That's just my guesswork. I think he came up with something, under a lot of pressure, which was pretty spectacular. And so he came up with the whole murder theory. There's not one shred of evidence that Elmira's brothers went after him. There's not. It's whole cloth. It's can you rule it out completely? Can you prove it didn't happen? Can you prove a negative? No. So like I said, I even that I would not take off the table. I'd say unlikely. But once again, I'm not here to basically say it has to be this. I knew from the start I couldn't do that.
Yeah, someone suggested to me, and I've never heard this before. I don't remember who it was, that with the whole cooping theory and being in someone else's clothing, he would have had a hat, and that there's the possibility of some kind of spider that was in the hat and bit him, and that's what happened. And I was like, that's an interesting theory. I'd never heard of that one before, but wanted to throw that out there with just, and again, I don't remember who told me that, but I was like,
We'll put that up on the board too.
Okay. Yeah.
You had to bring spiders into this.
Yeah.
Ryan Reynolds killed him. That's why he was screaming out Reynolds.
There you go. Yes.
It was Deadpool.
It's Daredevil.
Oh, maybe it was Reynolds Clothing Store.
There you go.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
It was the bandit, Burnt Reynolds. He did it.
Oh, there you go.
Michelle's this mustache.
Well, and then of course, my brain has always gone to, could if he really did say Reynolds, was that some type of cryptogram that you have to decipher, because he was so good at that? But it's like, if he was in that state of delirium or fever, would he have been able to even do something like that? And so but I always think about those little things.
I like Will's suggestion. It was Frank Reynolds from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Oh.
Danny DeVito did it.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. That is too funny.
I like that. It's a link to New Jersey because Danny DeVito is from New Jersey. So awesome.
Oh, okay. Oh. Well, I think we have. I think I had made a list of everything that I had studied, over the years and recently, and I think we hit every single one plus of all the different theories around his death. So,
Okay, I'm going to have to say it. I have to say it, Carmen.
Uh-oh.
We have talked Poe to death. Just saying. I had to go there. I had to say it.
Jeanie has been full of puns and things all week. Actually really for about 2 weeks. Almost everything she says kind of comes out that way. So we'll take it, Jeanie. Well, Chris and Mark, we really appreciate you guys being able to talk with us and give us such great information. You guys really have, so much about Poe, and it just adds to our discussions. And we really appreciate you guys so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tomorrow night.
Yeah, we love having you guys on. So, yeah, wish we could be there for your discussion tomorrow night, Mark.
You got time, drive on down.
Yeah.
Technically, I'm on spring break. I could.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anybody else have anything else to add? Well, this has been awesome. And let's see, next month, I think I meant to look this up. Jeanie, what is next month?
Oval portrait.
Yes, it is the oval portrait. And I think, Chris, you're going to join us for that one as well.
Okay.
I think that's what we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, that's right.
But I'm excited for that one because I don't think that one gets as much read time or discussion time as other stories of Poe's. So, so that'll be good. And I think Leela suggested that one. So thank you.
No, I suggested Pym.
Pym. I always forget. And I think so. Keith, it was Keith, and you made suggestions at the exact same time, so I get them confused.
Oh, that's okay.
So, yeah. So oval portrait next for April, and then Pym for May. So Pym is not something. I mean, you could read it in a day, but it does take a little longer because it's a novel. So I guess on that note, we are done for the evening. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And we look forward to next month.
Bye.
See you all again.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.